Okay, colleagues, I'm really delighted to introduce our speaker today, Ms. Ananke Meintjies, who is one of our brilliant postgraduate students in the department. And if you got the ad, you will have read her fabulous bio. So I won't read all of it. I'll just say that Ananke works in the broad field of post-colonial eco-criticism, and her current work is specifically interested in the links between environmental change and human migration, and the ways in which climate change specific migration gets to be reflected in cultural identities. And I'm especially excited about this work because Ananke is kind of busy as one of the local pioneers, I should say, of this field called the vegetal humanities or the plant humanities, which I'm really excited about. And her work on Amitav Ghosh's texts, on his fictional work, Sea of Poppies, is just absolutely brilliant. And I'm so grateful to Ananke for introducing me to this trilogy. I've actually only read the one, The Sea of Poppies, but I can't wait to read the rest. I've long been a fan of Ghosh's non-fictional texts, and it's kind of shameful that I'm only now coming to his actual fictional work. So thanks so much, Ananke, for that. And then, yeah, with that, I'm going to just give it over to Ananke. The title of her paper is The Subaltern at Sea, Studying the Eradication of Caste and the Establishment of New Identities Aboard Ghosh's Fictional Ibis. Thank you, Ananke.
Thank you, Professor Strauss, for that introduction. And good day, everyone. I would first like to thank you all for making the time to log into this presentation. It would have been quite disheartening if I had to do this presentation just talking into the ether. So thank you very much. Today, I will be discussing a specific section of my own master's research on Amitav Ghosh's novel titled Sea of Poppies. And the topic that I will be discussing with you all today, I've actually only recently started to develop into an essay or paper, or an individual essay or paper, as the chapter which explores Ghosh's novel in my master's dissertation predominantly focuses on environmental agency and Ghosh's use of specific narrative tools to emphasize the spiritual and agentic interplay between human beings and the environments that they inhabit. But today I am actually choosing to focus more on the human aspect of Ghosh's novel and to discuss how he intricately weaves a narrative that reveals how human identity is shaped and then reshaped by a multitude of factors. And these factors include relationships, appearance, culture, caste, and of course, the binary forces of liberation and oppression. Furthermore, this presentation mainly focuses on the colonial context of Ghosh's novel, looking specifically at the author's depictions of how the British colonizers imposed rigid identities on the rural Indian populace during the 19th century, essentially stripping them of their own sense of self and forcing them into predefined roles. And this presentation will then also discuss how this act of othering served to dehumanize and control the autochthonous citizens of India, creating a social hierarchy that justified exploitation and domination. This is quite heavy stuff, but not to worry. This presentation isn't only going to deal with negative issues. I will also take the time to discuss how Ghosh's novel shows the resilience of the human spirit, in the sense that through the journeys of the novel's characters, we, the readers, witness their struggle to reclaim and redefine identity in the face of overwhelming odds. And as they journey towards the ship that will ultimately take them across vast and unfamiliar waters towards Marich or Mauritius, the relationships that these characters form with new characters emerge as sources of strength, offering a sense of belonging and continuity. And by the end of this presentation, it will become clear how, through establishing new connections and identities, the human cargo aboard the ship called the Ibis become liberated in a sense, and their self-liberation, though fraught with challenges, becomes a powerful force of self-realization and empowerment. Now, one thing to note about the novel Sea of Poppies is that it is absolutely huge, at least to me, and it has an absolutely gargantuan cast of characters. And since the novel has so many protagonists, and all of them have rather long and complicated histories, I have decided to narrow down my discussion to three of the novel's protagonists instead. And I do this just to avoid confusing everyone with too much information at once. And the three characters that I will be focusing on are called Diti, Kalua, and Neil. And in Sea of Poppies, which is only the first book, as Professor Strauss said, in the Ibis trilogy, Ghosh exposes the subaltern world of these three characters who respectively face the discriminations of the caste, gender, and colonial systems. Now, I want to start by addressing the caste system first, because it is a deeply entrenched issue that has left a scar on Indian society. Even today, caste and social structure hold significant importance in Indian society. And this is a fact that was also evident in 19th century British India. Since falling under British rule, India has experienced numerous societal and structural changes due to the interaction between the two nations, cultures, and races. And this dynamic between India as the colony and Britain as the colonizer, coupled with the influence of colonial ideology, led to the reinforcement of religious and caste divisions. And the caste system has alienated countless individuals, silencing their voices for generations. What is more, the pain of those in the lower castes often remains hidden from the world, as they are confined to their designated untouchable spaces, essentially excluded from mainstream society, and of course, by extension, then artistic representation as well. As observed by Alok Mukherjee, lower caste individuals become the occupants of the space outside the village, so they live on the fringes of society. And in the novel, the character named Kalua is emblematic of this form of exclusion, as it is stated that the very sight of Kalua's face is thought to bring about undesired events or even bad luck. And I'm going to substantiate this claim by describing a heartbreaking specific scene from the novel where Kalua, who drives an ox cart to earn a living, is transporting a high caste Rajput named Hukam Singh along with some of his belongings. And during the scene, Hukam Singh sees to it that none of his belongings come into contact with Kalua's body, and he also makes sure to avoid eye contact at all costs, as the very sight of Kalua's face can defile him. Now, in this scene and in several others, it becomes clear that the caste system is woven into the fabric of everyday life and practice. It is a hereditary and hierarchical system that is unchangeable due to its religious sanctioning, and it has perpetuated the notion of certain people as being polluted and therefore untouchable. Essentially, the caste system has created a foundation where exclusion, subjugation, dispossession, and oppression are not merely incidental, but are direct consequences of this fundamental reality. But not only does the caste system serve to alienate certain individuals, it also dehumanizes them. And I'm going to refer to an example from the novel once again. There is a specific and very disturbing scene wherein Kalua is dehumanized when he is forced to commit an act of bestiality with a horse. And this is done simply to amuse a couple of rich landowners. And during this specific occurrence, Ghosh emphasizes Kalua's dehumanized state as he describes Kalua's cries of utter humiliation as becoming completely indistinguishable from the horse's distressed whinnying. And after suffering this humiliation, Kalua is then left in the mud covered in his own blood, as he had also been brutally whipped with a horsewhip. And this scene takes place relatively early on in the novel, which proves that the author is preoccupied with bringing to light the ruthless dangers inflicted by human beings upon other human beings in the guise of caste distinctions. Now, as much as Kalua is alienated and oppressed by the caste system, Diti, who will eventually become Kalua's wife, is initially a victim of gender discrimination in the novel. And as they both live in an organized patriarchal society, the women therein are considered as mere beasts of burden with a human face, as Simone de Beauvoir aptly describes in her book titled The Second Sex. But of course, she doesn't reference this directly in relation to Ghosh's novel. But I thought it was a very apt description. And in this kind of society, the master or husband exalts his pride through tyrannical authority and turns against women. And in doing so, he gains power, but at their expense. On the other hand, women who suffer both physically and psychologically are considered secondary citizens due to rigid gender roles. Now, Diti is a very interesting character. Her life, which is governed by destiny and the stars, is further complicated by her meager marriage prospects. She is believed to be cursed by the influence of Saturn or Shani, and it is believed to be her fate to bring discord, unhappiness, and disharmony in her marriage. And this astrological belief brands her as a misfit for marriage. But against all odds, Diti does get married, and she marries Hukam Singh, who you remember as the Rajput in Kalua's cart. But she's unaware of his addiction to opium. And on their wedding night, she discovers his addiction when he states, "This is my first wife," referring to the drug. And it is here where Diti realizes that her destiny, which is marked by the shadow of Saturn, has led her into a life of hardship and subjugation. Now, if you can believe it, DT's wedding night takes an even darker turn as she is drugged with opium and then raped by her brother-in-law, Kadan Singh. And all of this is done in the presence of her mother-in-law and her husband's relative, Subadar Bhairo Singh. And this horrific violation represents the ugliest phase of women's oppression, where even familial boundaries are violated with impunity. And not too long after this dramatic ordeal, DT realizes that she is pregnant. And in her confusion and despair, she wonders who could have impregnated her if not her husband. And she also wonders what exactly happened that night, referring to her wedding night. And her condition is depicted as rather pathetic as she struggles with this uncertainty of her child's paternity. And it is only through the cruel sort of hints dropped by her mother-in-law that DT eventually realizes that her daughter, called Kabutri, is fathered by Kadan Singh and not her husband, Hukum Singh. And as the years pass, DT endures relentless torments from her brother-in-law, Kadan Singh, who desires to make DT his mistress after her husband's death. And he threatens her with the loss of her husband's land, declaring, and I quote, "My brother's land and his house will become mine on his death. He who owns the land owns the rice, and I become master of this house. Or when I become master of this house, how will you get by except at my pleasure?" But despite these threats, DT refuses to surrender to his carnal desires, and instead she resolves to die as a sati when Hukum Singh unexpectedly passes away. And for those of you who do not know, becoming a sati entails that a widow be burned alive on her husband's funeral pyre out of a sense of duty to her husband and master. And Kadan Singh, mocking DT's resistance, reminds her of her unchastity since she had been impregnated by him and not her husband. And he taunts her, saying that he would be happy if she dies as a sati, as it would make their family famous. And he adds, "We'll build a temple for you and we'll grow rich on the offerings." But DT's desperate situation reaches a turning point with the timely intervention of Kalua, who helps her escape this horrific death. And Kalua essentially tackles a delirious and drugged DT off of Hukum Singh's funeral pyre, and together they flee from their rural town. And of course, their flight incites her husband's relatives to pursue them, aiming to kill them so that they might restore their family's honor. And it is through this dire escape that DT and Kalua are transformed into Gurmitias, or indentured laborers, on the ship called the Ibis, which is destined for Mauritius. And in this new life, they are stripped of their identities. For example, DT becomes Aditi, and Kalua is recorded as Madhu Kalua. But something happens, and the English, either misinterpreting or mishearing him, changes his name to Madho Culver in the ship's records. And as Dinesh Kumar aptly states, both DT and Kalua become outsiders to their society. DT for abandoning her dying husband and her daughter, Kalua for living with an upper caste Hindu woman. And gender suffocates DT, and Kalua is ostracized by caste norms, and they represent two different marginal locations of colonial India. And DT's story underscores the suffocating grip of gender and caste discrimination. her refusal to succumb to Karam Singh's demands and her eventual escape with Kahlua highlight the resilience and courage needed to defy these oppressive structures. And their transformation into indentured laborers or girmitjas signifies not only their loss of identity, but also the pervasive impact of colonialism, which further marginalizes the already oppressed. In fact, DT and Kahlua are oppressed to such an extent that they are forced to make the conscious decision to become girmitjas or indentured laborers. This difficult decision is a final and desperate attempt to escape their dire situation. And unfortunately, this decision leads them into an even more dreadful and uncertain existence. Because you see, for the Girmityas, the reality is rather harsh. It works in a way where their families receive payment and then they are transported far, far away, as if into the netherworld. And in the novel, when Diti first hears about the Girmityas, she immediately imagines the unbearable nature of such a life. But she, at that stage, is still unaware of the fact that she herself will one day become a Girmitya. I now quote a passage from the novel which proves Diti's internal struggle with the idea of living the rest of her life as a slave on foreign soil. I quote, "She tried to imagine what it would be like to be in their place, to know that you were forever an outcast, to know that you would never again enter your father's house, that you would never throw your arms around your mother, never eat a meal with your sisters and brothers, never feel the cleansing touch of the Ganga, and to know also that for the rest of your days you would eke out a living on some wild, demon-plagued island." And this passage shows that the decision to become Girmityas is by no means an easy one for Diti and Kahlua. It is rather a final resort to escape the brutal executions they'd both face if they were captured by Diti's relatives. Now, along with the issues of caste and gendered subjectivity, as exemplified by Diti and Kahlua's journeys, Ghosh also reveals the plight of a bankrupt zamindar named Neil under the horrible clutches of colonialism. Now, Neil, who is a Raja of Rashkali, initially gives too much importance to caste and creed, but this is when he still enjoys his highborn status. But he later personally suffers as a social outcast in the hands of the British colonizers. And his downfall begins when he is accused of forgery in his dealings with a man named Benjamin Burnham, who is a wealthy British merchant. And this accusation leaves him a bankrupt landowner who is subject to the whims of British officials. And his trial is a stark demonstration of colonial injustice, where it becomes evident that the law favors the British and harshly discriminates against the native Indian populace. And Ghosh goes to great lengths to portray Neil's trial as this absolutely unfair and frustrating process. Actually, there were several instances where I was just tempted to fling the book into our swimming pool because it is just so unfair and prejudicial. Now, in court, Neil is declared a convict and he becomes a victim of a legal system designed to protect the colonizers and further oppress the colonized. And Neil himself remarks that the British had become the world's new Brahmins. And this is quite a powerful metaphor which highlights their dominant and untouchable status. And it is important to know that throughout his life, Neil had always strictly adhered to caste rules, and he'd never even consumed food prepared by unknown hands. However, his incarceration forces him into a position where his body actually physically resists the intake of prison food, and this symbolizes his profound cultural and personal displacement. Cast away as a convict, Neil is thrown in with thousands of Pindaris, thugs, dacoits, rebels, headhunters, and hooligans. And this is a very stark contrast to his former princely status. And this degradation illustrates the sweeping and dehumanizing effects of colonialism, which spares no one, not even those who once held power and privilege within their own society. And in the midst of his despair, Neil starts to contemplate the idea of escape. However, this fleeting thought is quickly extinguished by the realization of the overwhelming dominance of the British Empire. And he recalls the map in his office, marked by a rapid spread of the empire, which essentially causes the map to be just colored in red, completely stained red. Such is the power and extent of the British Empire. And this vivid image underscores the inescapable reach and control of the colonizers. And Neil's inner dialogue reveals this helplessness that he feels. And I quote, "For a wild instant, the idea of escape lodged in Neil's mind, but only to vanish as he recalled the map that hung in his daftar and the red stain of empire that had spread so quickly across it. Where would I hide?" he said. "The piadas of Rashkali can't fight the battalions of the East India Company. No, there's nothing to be done," end quote. And this moment of realization highlights the futility of resistance against such an all-encompassing and powerful force. And by now it is clear that Ghosh uses Neil's situation to illustrate the crushing weight of colonial power, which leaves no room for rebellion or escape. In fact, the vastness and efficiency of the British Empire's military and administrative machinery make any thought of resistance seem absurd and hopeless. And Neil's reflection on the inability of the local Indian piadas to stand against the well-equipped battalions of the East India Company further emphasizes the disparity in power and resources between these two nations. And after his arrest and upon entering Alipore jail, Neil's initial experience in captivity is rather grim, as he is stripped naked before the English master, who very closely scrutinizes his body. And to Neil, it feels as though his body has been relinquished to a new proprietor, who inspects it much like one would examine a recently acquired house, searching for any signs of deterioration or neglect. And as a former zamindar, he feels utterly powerless to defend himself against the English master's cruelty. And adding to his despair, his forehead is then tattooed with Roman letters declaring him, and I quote, "Forgerer Alipore 1838, end quote. And this is a humiliating fate that he could never have anticipated. But perhaps the worst punishment Neil has to face in India is the fact that he has to clean and nurse back to health his very sick cellmate named Afat. And when both Neil and Afat eventually board the Ibis to be transported to a jail in Mauritius, they are both chained to posts like animals. And the Ibis's Subadar Bhairo Singh employs various methods to abuse the former Raja of Rashkali, essentially treating him and his fellow convicts with disdain. For example, he handles their chains and he herds them along like cattle. He prods them and occasionally strikes them with his lathi. And to Subadar Bhairo Singh, Afat appears as a filthy foreigner, while Neil is regarded as a fallen outcast. And these prisoners, deemed misbegotten and befouled, are subjected to insults by the Subadar for the mere entertainment of the Meintjies and Siladars. And with this final transition from land to sea, it is now time for me to address the crux of my paper, which is the roles that journeying and movement play in the process of identity construction, or rather reconstruction. And I want us all to make a mental shift from spaces of land to the vast and unfamiliar expanse of the Indian Ocean. Now, in the novel, the ship Ibis symbolizes the subaltern world, or the subaltern reality, as it transports convicts and slaves to Mauritius. And the ship was originally built to serve as a blackbirder for transporting slaves. So it was essentially first a slave ship, but its owner, Burnham, had acquired her with an eye for fitting her for a different trade, which is the export of opium. And the Ibis fulfills its grim purpose by carrying men and women from various marginalized groups towards an uncertain fate. And in the novel, it is described how the Germitias are mostly confined to a small and dark space below the Ibis's deck, and they are forced to ponder their journey without any real information regarding their route or what awaits them in Mauritius. And in their state of fear and uncertainty, Ghosh depicts how they start to tell each other all sorts of nightmarish stories they'd heard of what their lives might be like in Mauritius. And guys, this really just doesn't help things. But I guess it is a very human reaction and a form of psychological bonding. But it is not all grim, and something rather wonderful happens along the way to Mauritius. Despite the discomfort, abuse, and overwhelming fear of the unknown that the Germitias face once they're all at sea, their shared experiences lead to them to form new and strong relationships below the deck of the Ibis. And this would not have been possible had there not been a sense of diasporic consciousness instilled within the Germitias through their travels and their turbulent journey across the vast waters of the Indian Ocean. Now, what I mean by diasporic consciousness is that issues such as unbelonging, alienation, nostalgia, homesickness, cultural ties, and self-identity are all crucial factors in defining oneself in unfamiliar contexts. And this self-identity is shaped by individuals' past roles, current situations, and then future prospects. And in Ghosh's novel, the people who board the Ibis as indentured laborers are all disheartened, having suffered from natural disasters, colonial oppression, hunger, poverty, or challenging circumstances in the Ganges region, which forced them to leave their homelands. But their socio-religious and cultural identities gradually transform as they embark on a new phase of life away from their past hardships. And despite their dire situation, their determination to live inspires them to start afresh. And below the deck, the Germitias distance themselves from previous constraints related to caste, community, and religion. And astonished by their cultural differences, they begin to form a unified identity as indentured laborers or as Germitias. In fact, the Germitias begin to consider each other as ship siblings. And through their relentless efforts, they manage to create for themselves a world where they are liberated from the discriminating thoughts and practices of the upper crust of society. And this achievement is a testament to their resilience and unity. Indeed, they endure the predicaments of oceanic travel whilst living a sort of secret double life below the deck of the Ibis, where they celebrate culinary practices, methods of agriculture, polyglot language, folk songs, as well as by participating in rituals of love, relationships, marriage, and hope. For example, in this third part or third section of the novel, which is titled Sea, A wonderful scene depicts a secret wedding performed by the Meintjies below the deck of the Ibis. And in the passage below, Ghosh depicts the transformative effect that the Ibis has had on the migrants as they come together to participate in this wedding, which is a ceremonial representation of a possible fluidity across cultural boundaries. And I quote, "The wedding being a special occasion, the migrants had pooled their resources and gathered a few lamps and candles to light the dabusa for the last part of the nuptials. The candles were found and duly lit, but when they were carried to the center of the dabusa, the fiery tali was found to have developed a mind of its own. With the ship rolling and pitching, it went shooting around the deck, threatening to set the whole dabusa alight. It was clear that someone would have to be stationed beside it to hold it in place. But who? There were so many volunteers that a half dozen men had to be assigned to the task so as not to give anyone cause for offense." And I want you all to just share with me this mental image of 6 fully grown men eagerly throwing up their hands because they so want to be part of this ceremony. I use this example in the first chapter of my dissertation as well, as I think it perfectly captures how the interhuman connections established aboard the Ibis transcend all social, geographical, and cultural boundaries, creating an almost utopian imaginary universe where all forms of life are entirely equal. Various strict categories of incompatibility are cast aside below the Ibis's deck, such as the inviolability of marriage across cultures, as well as the discordancy between castes. So together, the Meintjies forge for themselves a new identity rooted in diaspora. And as Stuart Hall states in his book titled Cultural Identity and Diaspora, diaspora identities are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. So these characters are highly adaptive and manage to adjust well to their new roles and surroundings. And this ability to relocate and adapt to new spaces gives Ghosh's characters an edge, as they now belong to a new group of people who are not weighed down by the burden of otherness and are blessed with a diasporic hope that gives them the strength to combat anxiety. And although the novel depicts an era of forced diaspora where characters are compelled to leave their homeland with no choice for survival, it also offers a new perspective on diasporic sensibility through the restoration of migrants, the restoration of migrants and the reconstruction of identity. So in Sea of Poppies, Ghosh represents a novel approach to diasporic consciousness. Instead of lamenting over their past, his characters actively form new identities to confront their new circumstances. And despite feeling dejected, they find ways to cope with their lives by reconstructing their identities according to the situation. And in his book, Hall continues to explain this occurrence as well. He states the diaspora experience is not defined by essence or purity, but by the recognition of a necessary heterogeneity and diversity, by a conception of identity which lives with and through, not despite difference, by hybridity. Thus, diaspora identities are those which are constantly producing and reproducing themselves anew through transformation and difference. And it is specifically in the third section of the novel, where the Indian Ocean is the only geographic setting, where Ghosh adopts a tone of self-possession, which focuses on the triumph of the human condition in the face of extreme adversity. And in this section of the novel, perhaps more than in the others, especially Diti, Kalua, and Neil start to display a strong sense of dignity through their worst psychological and physical traumas, up to this point in the trilogy at least. For Diti, this happens when she adopts the role of Bauji, which essentially translates to matron, and especially the younger, unmarried women often look to her for guidance and wisdom. And this role is certainly a big improvement from her former role as a submissive housewife back in her home village. As for Kalua, he gains a certain authority through the integral role he plays in DT's establishment as a leader. And although he's not menacing with words, Kalua's imposing frame ensures that the women aboard the Ibis are fairly well protected, at least physically. Furthermore, during an instance where DT's leadership and authority are challenged by a quick-tongued and quick-witted young man called Jakru, Kalua intervenes and puts an end to this challenge once and for all. And I also think that Ghosh deals with Kalua's caste situation in a very realistic way. Since he is a social anthropologist, Ghosh knows that after having suffered ignominy and abuse his entire life, Kalua could never convincingly behave like upper caste people. Thus, in the novel, it is DT's caste status that is diminished instead of Kalua's being elevated. For example, aboard the riverboat taking the migrants to the Ibis, DT introduces herself and Kalua as Shamars to the other Girmitias. And just to clarify, the Shamars form part of the leather workers caste, which is a fairly lower caste level that DT was born into. However, this doesn't really affect DT negatively at all, since she had been raised as an upper caste woman her entire life. DT's overall behavior means that she maintains, although unofficially, her high-ranking traditional qualities, at least in the eyes of the other Girmitias. And as for Neil, his dignity is gradually re-established as he listens to the stories that the Girmitias tell each other as they form new relationships. Now, you must understand, for the entire seafaring journey depicted in Sea of Poppies, Neil is kept in an even more cramped and isolated space compared to the other human cargo. And I suppose one could call such a space a hold, although I'm not too familiar with ship lingo. And of course, these stories are told in the dialect that Neil grew up speaking in. But as time went by and as his social status was raised, Neil had gradually replaced his mother tongue with the language of the colonizers, which is English. Ultimately, Neil's transformation from a zamindar to a common prisoner highlights his humanitarian perspective and connection as he systematically aligns himself with the common man through his friendship with Afat. And through this friendship with another prisoner who is of Chinese descent, Neil retains his grace and dignity, and this portrays him as a fully realized human being and also as an epic hero. And through these three characters that I've been...
Sorry, if you can start to wrap up, then we'll have 10 minutes for discussion.
Okay, I'm going to skip a part.
Okay, because we've got 11 minutes left in the session.
Okay.
Thanks.
So I'm going to skip to the final sort of point that I'm making, which is that Ghosh conveys that people are all fundamentally similar and can share a common identity, leaving behind the divisions of caste, race, culture, and even the politically and geographically defined borders between nations. And this portrayal of mutual relationships nurtures a sense of brotherhood, humanity, and universal unity. And for Ghosh, the Ibis not only unites the characters, but also symbolizes the world of India, as he is able to sort of depict all of these various practices within a very confined space, but this still gives us a relatively clear picture of the diversity of India. So through his novel, where Ghosh repeatedly broaches the concept of identity, he effectively reminds readers that human identity is not a static or singular construct. In fact, identity is dynamic, influenced by various factors, and constantly evolving. So essentially, Ghosh's novel challenges us to recognize the humanity in every individual and to resist the simplistic categorizations that serve to divide and diminish us. And that's all from me.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Ananke. Oops, sorry. I see I muted myself. Apologies. Thanks so much, Ananke. This was incredibly interesting and generative and rich. And I'm sure we're going to have some interesting questions from the audience. So if anyone wants to ask a question, please raise your hand now. Perhaps while people are formulating their thoughts, I can just quickly kick this off with a question. Ananke, there's so many interesting parts of the text that you highlighted. I'm interested in the sort of the overlap between what one might call toxic social relations and the question of material toxicity. In many of the descriptions you provided of sort of class and caste divisions, you used words like pollute, like DT or higher caste people might be polluted if they look at Kalua. And I also know that, Neil's transformation in his dealings with Arfat and with, the food, it stems from very specific sort of interpersonal strictures, but it plays out in very material ways. So I was wondering if you could maybe just talk about that intersection. And I see Rick has or had a hand up. Perhaps, Rick, did you want to ask now, and then Ananke can maybe address both of our questions?
Thanks, Aline. Let me come in after Ananke's given a response to you.
Okay.
So, Professor Strauss, are you talking, or do you want me to highlight some of the material aspects of the caste and cultural divisions in Sea of Poppies? I just want to know that I have understood the question correctly.
My question actually stems in part from the larger issue of just polluted environments and the materiality of the material effects of this particular history on our planet, on our climate, on our material environments, the way in which the natural world was affected by this particular history. So that's kind of where I'm headed, and that's where I see the overlap between like pollution as an actual physical thing and also the way in which interpersonal relationships were constructed.
Yes, this is a very prominent sort of feature in Ghosh's novel. What I didn't deal with today is, and I probably should say this, that this novel is set against the backdrop of the opium wars of the 19th century. And opium not being indigenous, or essentially it was instilled as a form of monoculture farming in India, which I don't know if many of you are familiar with the dangers of monoculture farming, but it completely destroys the richness of the soil and the ability of the soil to firstly recover after these practices have been stopped, and then to regenerate plants that are supposed to be in the area where they grow naturally. So in the novel itself, it is explained that the British came and forced the Indian farmers to solely invest their time and labor in planting opium or poppies for opium. And this completely destroyed the richness of the soil. So in terms of material realities and how that was affected, it is also stated that the Indian farmers eventually, they couldn't grow crops for themselves, not to go and sell at the markets, and not to eat, not to use for traditional medicine as well. So yeah, so I think the main concern environmentally speaking in the novel is the practice of monoculture farming and the dangers that that entails. I hope that answers the question, at least partly.
Yes, certainly. Thank you, Ananke. Rick, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ananke. I'm sorry I joined only halfway through, or even later than that. So my question is going to be very generic, and not nearly as clever as Eileen's, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about just what drew you to your topic, broadly speaking, not necessarily the text under discussion today and the focus, but what inspired the intellectual curiosity behind it?
Well, I guess I was kind of conditioned to think in a certain way and to approach doing research in a certain way, actually through my honors essay, which dealt with Richard Powers' is the Overstory, which is a title that I keep throwing around because I love the book so much. It is just the way that I think and approach life now, having read that novel. And after having read Sea of Poppies, the engagement with scenery and the environment and plant life and everything like that, it is so rich. And I think actually the story itself might be simple, but the book is this long and this thick due to the fact that setting and environment is engaged with so well. And yeah, so it is just a beautiful description. You get to know India in detail, and not just the spaces of land. You get to engage with spaces of river and ocean as well. So it is a beautiful book, but I was already in that mindset after my honors essay. Anything to do with plants, I'm game.
Right, thank
I
you.
hope that answers the question.
It does, thank you.
Thank you, Ananke. Any other questions from our audience? If people are still, oh, there I see Babawa has a question. Please go ahead.
Presentation. I was just wondering if you have thought of linking the story to the Indian identity in South Africa, considering that they have similar stories, and some of the Indian researchers have actually spoke about the castelessness that happened on route. I mean, I believe they have a more similar story. So I was wondering if you have thoughts about that in your work. Thank you.
I certainly have thought about maybe just moving my research closer to home. I can't do that with my master's research at the moment. All the texts have been chosen. But in terms of if I go on, if the department will have me, and if I go on with a PhD, I certainly would like to move my research closer to the African context, because I feel that it is just as rich as sort of these stories that we read about colonial India. The narrative is very much the same. So, but that would entail me reading and going on a sort of book hunt to find stories that both deal with the colonial aspect of certain parts of Africa, but also address environmentalism as well. So for me to do that, I'm going to have to maybe make for myself a little book list and see if I can get something like that.
Thank you, Ananke. I see we're almost out of time and I don't see another hand, so maybe I'll just quickly jump in with one last question. I want to again return to the more eco-critical side of the paper and the work, and again maybe turn to the notion of dehumanization and the category of the human. In a number of the descriptions that you read or referenced, you talked about sort of the bestial, for instance, that horrific scene where Kalua is kind of brutalized, like where he's almost sort of equalized with a horse. And while that is serves as a form of dehumanization for him, there's also something else perhaps at work in the way in which the text treats non-human animals and questions this very hierarchy of the human. I wondered if you could just very quickly speak to that.
Certainly, as I've said, that the majority of the paper that I've already submitted, the first chapter, it deals with predominantly environmental agency and sort of the spiritual and agentic interplay between the environment or the landscape and then the humans that inhabit it. And there are so many examples that I can use, but Ghosh, I feel he infuses a very alive and spiritual way of addressing elements of the environment throughout the novel. I think there's a scene where I describe in my first chapter where the ship, the Ibis, and also the ocean, they insert themselves as actual characters, and they are what sort of prompt and stimulate events to happen. So they move the plot forward. And there are very many instances in the novel where this happens, where the environment itself actually becomes a character. And I think I divided the chapter into 3 sections where I talk about environmental agency and environmental agency on land, and then I move to river, and then I move to sea. But in all of the sort of segments of the novel is divided into 3 parts: land, river, and sea. Ghosh introduces the environment not as a backdrop. The environment is itself a character. So I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ananke. I'm glad you got to share that perspective also with the audience, because that's such a fascinating part of your work and really, really important. So we are out of time. So I will just conclude by thanking everyone in the room for attending, and certainly thanking Ananke for sharing this really amazing work with us. Yes. And have a lovely day, everyone.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. I'll send out the link to the recording a bit later today.
Thanks, Hunter.
Thanks, Ananke, and thanks,
Well done,
Eileen.
Ananke. Excellent paper. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Thank
you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.